Hello, you're watching Breakfast with Roger Johnson and Naga Munchetti.
Good morning. The SNP leader, John Swinney, has said that his party will begin negotiations for a second independence referendum if it wins a majority of Scottish seats at the general election. So let's find out more. Let's talk to the Deputy First Minister of Scotland, Kate Forbes, who joins us live from Edinburgh. Kate Forbes, good morning to you. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us. So if you win a majority of seats, we've been talking about the Scotland football team this morning on the programme and the fact that they need something special hanging on in there at the moment for a good outcome. Is that the same for the SNP if you look at the polls?
Well, I've got great confidence in our Scotland team, I should say, at the top of the programme. But in terms of the SNP's manifesto, as you said at the top of the programme, we believe that this election offers an opportunity to people that support independence to give democratic effect to that support. Now, we've seen in the polls over the last year, while it's been a tough year for the SNP at times, the support for independence has remained rock solid. And during an election, people want to express their preferences. And so a vote for the SNP is a vote for independence, a vote to support independence. And for the SNP, it will be an opportunity to start discussions with the incoming UK government.
Which you may well start, but both Labour and the Conservatives have said that they won't countenance a second referendum for Scotland. The courts have said that that has to be the way in which it is done. So you're banging your head against a brick wall in that case, probably, aren't you?
Well, I mean, it's a pretty damning indictment of the state of democracy if people express their views and that is not in any way respected by an incoming UK government. But the point that we've made is that we already have a mandate in the Scottish Parliament. So right now in the Scottish Parliament, elected in 2021, there's a majority of seats in that Parliament of people who support independence. And in this election, you know, it's a change election. People are voting to get rid of this awful Conservative government. But the point that we make is that...
That might be a problem for you. Given that you've got so many seats in Scotland and you're trailing in the polls, people might be voting for change in Scotland too, and they might be voting more for Labour than for you.
Well, obviously, the poll that matters is on the 4th of July. But the point that we make is that in terms of delivering real change, it's only the SNP that can do that. You take the position, for example, on immigration. Both Labour and Conservatives are basically two sides of the same coin, whereas we want to advocate for a positive case for immigration. We recognise the impact of immigration on the Scottish economy, and yet neither UK governments are advocating any change in that regard. The same with the European Union and also austerity. So in this election, it's an opportunity to vote SNP to put Scotland's interests first. That means ultimately question on our constitutional future, but it also means holding the Labour government to account right now in terms of its damaging approach to our finances and also to immigration and our relationship with the EU.
You said that holding the Labour government to account. Do you mean, are you assuming that there will be a Labour government, or did you mean to say Conservative government?
Well, I'm assuming, I think the polls suggest that it will be a Labour government coming in after the 4th of July, unless something changes drastically, which I think is unlikely.
How genuinely, I mean, I don't want to spend the whole time talking about polls, because you're absolutely right, the poll that matters is on the 4th of July, but how concerned genuinely are you by what appears to be a resurgence of Labour in Scotland? You know, you almost swept the board last time in the Westminster election, but the polls suggest you could lose an awful lot of seats to Labour now.
Well, let's put this in two parts. The first is that we absolutely welcome an end to 14 years of Conservative rule. It's been disastrous for Scotland. It has bred an environment of disrespect for the Scottish Parliament, and we absolutely need to see an end to the Tories.
Just out of interest,
regard, we support change.
Sorry, Kate, sorry to interrupt on that point. I apologise for interrupting, but
that's okay.
Are you already in dialogue with Labour? Have you already talked to them? Are you hopeful of a more respectful, to use your phrase, relationship with the Westminster governing party, if it's a Labour Party government?
So we're not in dialogue, but we are hopeful of a reset in relationships. There has to be a reset. It can't get much worse. But the argument we would make is that if there is to be a Labour government, then sending as many SNP MPs to Westminster to represent Scotland is putting Scotland's interests first and is in the best interests of Scotland. I mentioned a number of policy areas there where Scotland has always expressed a different view, a positive approach to immigration, for example. We voted by a majority to remain in the EU. Our food and drink exports, which are the biggest food exports for the UK, rely on access to the EU single market. And so all of these points, we are very concerned to see the Labour Party doubling down, as it were, on 14 years of Tory austerity. And to quote Wes Streeting, the Labour spokesperson on health, when it comes to funding, all roads lead back to Westminster. That's the way that devolved government works. And so that's why in our manifesto we have set out a different approach to properly funding our public services, which is critical after COVID and considering the strain on them.
Does that explain why, talking about public services, devolved things like NHS waiting lists, taxes in Scotland, does that explain why people might be disillusioned with the Holyrood government, which is run by you?
Well, you talked about taxes there, and in the environment of austerity we have made difficult choices on progressive taxation, which has mitigated, again, some of the worst of the austerity. So it's contributed about £1.5 billion to overall public spend. And that's why we have the best A&E units anywhere in the UK for 9 years. It's why we have better funded public servants. Our doctors, our nurses, our carers are paid on average more than elsewhere in the UK. And that's because we've made choices. But it's in the environment of austerity that we've had to make those choices. And I'd much rather resolve this at source. I'd much rather see an incoming UK government that decided 14 years of austerity has been damaging. We need to change tack and we need to invest in our public services, which will mean more funding for the Scottish Government and indeed for the Welsh administration and the Northern Irish administration as well.
So are you saying that it's because of austerity, which some people might think was a long time ago, there's been a cost of living crisis, sure, and a pandemic. Is that why, for example, you haven't delivered on things like waiting lists, education in Scotland is struggling? Those are devolved issues that your government is directly responsible for, that you perhaps haven't delivered what you promised to deliver, and therefore that might be why people are looking for an alternative. Albeit at Westminster, you'll get the real test of that in 2 years' time with the next Holyrood election.
Well, we are delivering on our plans to reduce waiting times, for example, and to properly invest, for example, in education and in our teachers. But I take a step back, look at the context for households, businesses and public bodies over the last few years. They would not suggest that austerity is over. They have experienced austerity for the full 14 years. They are still experiencing austerity, and the IFS suggests that if Labour continues with the Tory fiscal rules, that will mean £18 billion of cuts to our public services, which are already struggling. So households and businesses have suffered from the impact of Brexit.
Sorry to interrupt, but just to wrap it up, to go back to where we started, the IFS also says, with your avowed desire for independence, you've ignored the potential hit to economic growth from leaving the UK and the fiscal challenges that an independent Scotland would have to confront. So if you accept what the IFS is saying about Labour, you accept presumably what they're saying about independence.
Well, I accept what the IFS have said, for example, about our funding proposals that say that the £30 billion of additional revenue we could take by being back in the EU is not unreasonably high. And their figures on independence look at Scotland within the UK. The point being that we know the UK economy is extremely unequal, with a lot of activity concentrated in London and the South East, which is no way to run an economy. And that's why we are advocating for real change. And it will be SNP MPs that put Scotland's interests first, talk about Scottish jobs, Scottish industry, and a better future for Scotland.
Kate Forbes, thank you very much for talking to us this morning.
Thank you.